People think that landing a government railway job in India is a golden ticket. They picture you sitting in an air-conditioned cabin in New Delhi, sipping subsidized tea and retiring with a pension fat enough to buy a small island. But the reality is a lot grimmer. Sometimes your golden ticket buys you a one-way trip to a bureaucratic purgatory. My name is Suraj. A few years ago, I was an assistant station master, and thanks to a clerical error, or maybe just horrible karma, I got transferred to a place called Kusamgarh Junction. Calling it a junction was a hilarious overstatement. It was a single slab of cracked concrete drowning in a sea of dense sal and mahua forests in the absolute middle of nowhere, Jharkhand. I was 26, single, and my philosophy on life was incredibly simple. Do the bare minimum, collect the paycheck, and go home to my empty apartment. I did not care about office politics, nor did I care about climbing the ladder, and I certainly didn't believe in the local ghost stories the villagers whispered about. As far as I was concerned, the scariest thing in the dark was a surprise inspection from the divisional officer. When I arrived to take over the post, the outgoing station master, a guy named Mishra, was packing his things. Mishra looked like a man who had died 5 years ago, but his pension hadn't cleared yet, so his body simply refused to drop. He had these deep, bruised bags under his eyes and a nervous twitch that made him look like a caffeinated squirrel. During the handover, he walked me through the rusted control panels, the ledger books that smelled like rat urine, and the signal toggles. Then he zipped up his fox leather bag, looked me dead in the eye, and gave me a piece of advice that sounded like a threat. "Suraj, listen to me very carefully," Mishra rasped, his voice trembling slightly. "On the night shift, after 2:30 a.m., do not step out onto the platform. Lock the heavy iron door of your cabin from the inside, and whatever you do, leave the block signal unread. There are no passenger or freight trains scheduled on this route until 4 a.m. Nothing." I smirked, leaning back in the creaky wooden chair. "Why, Mishraji? We got man-eating tigers running a midnight express out here." Mishra didn't even crack a smile. He just stared at me with those hollow, exhausted eyes. "A tiger just eats your meat and leaves the bones, boy. Whatever comes through here, it doesn't leave anything behind. Just keep your head down and ignore it." I wrote it off instantly. Put an old man in a suffocating forest in absolute isolation for a decade, and his brain is bound to start inventing monsters just to keep him company. Then came my first night shift. By 1 a.m., Kusumgarh station was swallowed by a darkness so absolute it felt heavy on the lungs. The only light came from my cabin and 2 flickering, dying tube lights on the platform that hummed like angry hornets. The winter cold was vicious. I had my space heater cranked to the maximum, my boots kicked up on the control desk, listening to a battered cassette deck spitting out that warped Bollywood album just to drown out the deafening silence of the forest. The boredom was lethal. I checked the ledger. The last freight train had rumbled through at 11:30 p.m. The tracks were supposed to be dead until the 5 a.m. passenger local. It was 2:15 a.m. I was halfway through a stale cigarette and completely zoning out, my eyelids getting heavy. And then I heard it. The chug-chug, the massive, unmistakable grinding of iron wheels. I blinked the sleep out of my eyes and glanced at the analog clock on the wall. 2:40. I grabbed the ledger. Nothing. No passenger, no express, no freight. The telegraph machine from the control room had not made a single beep all night. Probably a diverted rake of empty scrap cars, I muttered to myself, annoyed that the noise was interrupting my nap. I stretched, groaning as my spine popped, and walked over to the thick glass window of my cabin. Outside, a thick, milky white fog had rolled in from the tree line, bleeding onto the platform like dry ice. And cutting slowly through that fog, rolling down the tracks, was a train. But it wasn't a diesel locomotive. It wasn't electric either. It was a massive, pitch-black steam engine, an absolute anachronism. It belched thick, oily smoke into the freezing air, bringing with it the harsh, choking stench of burning coal and rusted iron. The carriages trailing behind it looked like they had been dragged out of a museum and left in the rain for a century. The metal was heavily corroded, the paint peeling like dead skin. The windows were caked in so much grime that the faint, sickly yellow light from inside barely bled through. Without a single screech of the brakes, without blowing its horn, the massive phantom train coasted to a perfectly silent halt right in front of my cabin. My hand rested on the doorknob. Protocols dictated I go out, flash my torch, and see what the hell the conductor was paying at. But then I looked at the frost coming on the edges of the window. It was practically freezing out there, and my heater was blowing perfectly warm air directly onto my chair. Mishra's paranoid warning echoed in my head. After 2:30 a.m., do not step out. Honestly, I didn't care if it was a ghost train, a lost cargo shipment, or the Prime Minister's secret midnight joyride. I was not getting paid enough to freeze my ass off for an unscheduled stop. Screw it, I whispered. If the guard needs the signal turned green, he can march his own frozen feet into my cabin and ask. I pulled my hand off the doorknob, walked back to my chair, cranked the volume on the cassette deck, and closed my eyes. When I opened them 10 minutes later and glanced out the window, the platform was totally empty. The train had vanished into the fog without making a single sound. I didn't log it in the ledger. I didn't report it. My apathy was a shield, and I just assumed I'd hallucinated the whole thing out of sheer boredom. If I had known what was actually sitting inside those rusted carriages waiting for me, I would have torched the cabin and walked the 20 miles back to civilization that very night. Second night. The human brain is a fantastic, pathological liar. When you see something that completely shatters your understanding of reality, your brain immediately scrambles to build a bridge of logic over a canyon of pure insanity. I spent my entire day shift convincing myself that the train was just an illusion. Sleep deprivation mixed with dense fog and a healthy dose of isolation. It was a coping mechanism, and a pathetic one at that. But by the time I was back in that cabin for my second night shift, staring at the clock as the hands crept toward 2 a.m., my stomach was tied into a cold, hard knot. I couldn't focus on the magazine. I couldn't listen to the radio. I was just watching that clock. 2:30, 2:35, and then 2:40. Then I heard it again. And guess what? It was the same train. It rolled in with that same unnatural silence, cutting through a fog so thick it looked like the platform was floating on milk. This time, I didn't stay in my chair. I practically pressed my face against the freezing glass of my cabin window. It was definitely a relic. Through the grime on the carriages, I could just barely make out the faded, stenciled lettering, Awadh and Tirhut Railway. From what I knew, that line had not existed since the British left India. Then, right in front of my cabin, the heavy iron door of a carriage groaned open. 3 people stepped out onto the platform. They moved with a stiff, synchronized grace. It looked like a family, a man wearing a crisp, colonial-era tailored coat over a traditional dhoti, a woman standing slightly behind him, her face completely veiled by the heavy fabric of a dark sari, and standing between them, holding on to the woman's hand, was a little girl. Tucked under the girl's free arm was a crude, hand-carved wooden doll. They stepped into the sickly yellow glow of the flickering platform tube light and stopped. They just stood there, their backs facing my cabin, staring out into the absolute darkness of the tree line. No talking, no shivering in the freezing cold, and no movement. They were statues. I actually reached out for my door handle. My brain, desperately trying to keep me from losing my mind, supplied a terrible rationalization. Maybe they're just locals. Maybe they're lost. But before I could turn the knob, a massive, blinding wave of fog rolled over the platform, hitting the glass of my cabin. I was completely blinded for about 5 seconds. And when it cleared, the platform was empty. No family, no steam engine, nothing but the dying tube light buzzing in the cold. They hadn't walked away. You couldn't walk into that dense forest that fast without making a sound. They had simply ceased to exist. Then came night 3. My I don't give a damn attitude was officially dead and buried. That afternoon, I tried to ask the guy who ran the tea stall near the village about the train. He looked at me like I had just asked him for the recipe to crystal meth. The color completely drained from his face. He handed me my tea and whispered, "Keep your eyes on the ledger, Sahib. Do not look at things that are forgotten they are dead." Very helpful. Great local hospitality. By the time 2:40 a.m. rolled around on the third night, my palms were sweating so much that I couldn't hold my pen. The fog, the train, the exact same carriage stopping in the exact same spot. I was glued to the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The heavy iron door groaned open. And as expected, it was them. The man in the coat, the veiled woman, and the little girl with the wooden doll. They stepped out with the exact same stiff gait. They took the exact same number of steps. They stopped under the exact same flickering tube light and in the exact same formation. It wasn't a haunting. It was a playback, a glitch in the fabric of the universe. It was a corrupted VHS tape rewinding and playing the exact same tragic moment over and over every single night at 2:40 a.m. An echo of a tragedy trapped in a loop. I actually felt a wave of relief wash over me. If it was just a recording, it couldn't hurt me. It was just a movie playing on my platform. All I had to do was wait for the fog to roll in, and they would reset. But then, the tape broke. The little girl's fingers twitched. The wooden doll slipped from her grasp and hit the concrete platform with a hollow thwack. That didn't happen yesterday. The girl didn't look down at the doll. Instead, very slowly, her head began to pivot. Her neck cracked audibly, a sickening, wet snapping sound that echoed across the empty platform. She turned her head entirely around to look directly at my cabin, directly at me. She didn't have eyes. Where her eyes should have been, they were just deep, bruised hollow voids of absolute black. Then the woman slowly turned her veiled head toward me. And finally, the man. The playback was over. They knew I was watching. They knew that I was there. Before I could even take a step back, the door of the final carriage swung open. A man stepped out. He was dressed as a railway conductor, but the uniform was pure British Raj. Khaki shorts, high socks, a peaked cap. He held a rusted lantern in his left hand. He didn't have much of a facelift, just charred, blackened meat pulling away from a yellowed skull. He raised his lantern, fixing his empty sockets on my cabin, and then he slowly raised his right arm, pointing a long, skeletal burned finger directly at my door. I fell backward over my own chair. I scrambled across the floor on my hands and knees, slammed my entire body weight against the heavy iron door of the cabin, and threw both deadbolts locked. I yanked the faded curtains over the glass, plunging myself into the dim, red glow of the space heater. I crawled under the heavy wooden control desk, pulling my knees to my chest, shaking so violently my teeth were clicking together. For like a minute, there was nothing but the sound of my own hyperventilation. I thought maybe they had left. Maybe the fog had taken them. But then, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. The glowing red coils of my space heater flickered, turned a sickly, icy blue, and died completely. My breath plumed in the air in thick white clouds. On the desk above me, the battered cassette disc, which I had explicitly turned off, clicked on by itself. There was just static. It wasn't playing any Bollywood tunes. It was playing a warped, scratchy orchestral waltz, the kind you would hear on a gramophone in the 1940s. And beneath the music was the sound of weeping, agonizing, breathless, horrific weeping. Someone was at the door. Station master. A voice rasped from the other side of the glass. It sounded wet and hollow, like a man trying to speak with a throat full of ashes. Station master, change the signal to green. We want to go home. The voice didn't just come through the glass. It bored directly into my skull. I had my hands clamped over my ears, but I could still hear the wet, carbonized crackle in his throat. I could feel the charred British conductor pressing his rotting weight against the door. Suddenly, Mishra's parting words rang in my head like a church bell. Leave the block signal on red. And then it finally clicked. They weren't just haunting the station. They were trapped in a bureaucratic purgatory. They couldn't leave the platform, couldn't move on to whatever hell awaited them, until a living station master pulled that heavy iron lever and turned their signal green. They were asking for their departure clearance. And I knew, with absolute, gut-wrenching certainty, that if I opened the door and gave them the green light, they were going to punch my ticket too. I would be boarding that train with them. I stayed curled into a tight ball under the heavy wooden desk. My teeth were chattering so violently, I thought they would shatter. And then the knocking stopped. The suffocating cold receded just a fraction. The silence returned, heavy and ringing. I thought they had given up. I thought the loop had reset. Shaking uncontrollably, my muscles screaming in protest, I grabbed the edge of the desk and slowly pulled myself up just enough to peek over the top, towards the gap in the curtains covering the glass door. The conductor was gone, but standing there, her face pressed flush against the reinforced glass, was the little girl. Her hollow, bruised eye sockets were locked dead center on my face, and as I watched, paralyzed, she unhinged her jaw. She didn't scream. Instead, thick, Oily black smoke poured out of her mouth, like a chimney fire trapped in a human throat. The smoke hit the glass, and instantly the window began to freeze over in jagged, crystalline webs. The glass began to groan under the sheer pressure of the cold. Small, spiderweb fractures crawled across the thick pane. I realized in a moment of pure, blinding panic that the glass was going to shatter. The vacuum of whatever dimension they crawled out of was going to suck me right through the frame. I threw myself backward, scrambling until my spine hit the fore wall of the cabin, and I buried my head in my knees. I closed my eyes and waited for the glass to explode. I didn't know how long I sat there. Fear is a funny thing. It eventually exhausts your nervous system until you just short circuit. I must have passed out. When I finally opened my eyes, pale morning sunlight was bleeding through the cracks in the curtains. It was 6:15 a.m. My entire body was completely stiff. I used the wall to drag myself up to my feet. The first thing I looked at was the door. The glass was fully intact, but covering the bottom half of the pane were dozens of tiny, frantic handprints etched into the frost. Except they weren't on the outside of the glass. The handprints had been frantically scratching at the window from the inside of my cabin. I unlatched the heavy-headed bolts with trembling fingers and pushed the door open. The morning air was crisp and clear. The fog was gone. The nightmare train was gone. But right there on the concrete platform, exactly where the family had been standing, was a thick layer of black coal ash mixed with the distinct footprints of bare, charred feet. There was no night for. I didn't stick around to prove my bravery to the Indian Railways. I marched over to the main control console, grabbed a heavy padlock from the toolkit, and physically locked the track signal lever into the red position. I tossed the key into the forest. I didn't write a 2-week notice. I wrote a 2-sentence notice on the logbook. I quit, keep the pension. I packed my duffel bag in under 3 minutes and practically ran out of the station. On my way to the highway to flag down a bus, I stopped at a local tea stall. The vendor took one look at my pale face and the bag over my shoulder, and he didn't say a word. He just poured me a boiling cup of tea, set it on the counter, and finally gave me the missing pieces of the puzzle. November 1942, the vendor said quietly, staring out at the empty tracks. The Quit India movement was at its peak. The whole country was burning. A special train was routed through here late at night, carrying a British railway officer, his family, and a few high-value political prisoners. He took a slow drag from a beedi. The tracks ahead had been sabotaged by rebels. The train had to stop here at Kusumgarh, waiting for the all clear, waiting for a green signal. But the all clear never came. Instead, a violent mob emerged from the tree line. They trapped the officer's family and the conductor inside the carriage and set the train on fire. He looked at me, his eyes full of a grim, heavy pity. They burned alive on that platform, waiting for a green light that never came. They are still waiting, station master. It is good that you kept the door shut, because if you had given them the green signal, you would have been the one driving them to hell. It's been 8 years since I walked away from Kusumgarh Junction. I work a corporate desk job now, in a brightly lit glass building in New Delhi, where there are no shadows, no fog, and absolutely no trains. I heard through the grapevine that the railways officially decommissioned Kusumgarh a few years ago. No station master is ever posted there. No trains are routed through there after midnight. But trauma has a funny way of lingering in your blood. To this day, if I ever have to travel by train at night, I cannot sleep